So, what we're going to talk about today, I'm just going to introduce the overall topic and then we'll get rolling. We run webinars monthly at AbilityNet around accessibility issues, and this particular one is all about how to build and test accessible apps. As I say, about 30 to 45 minutes worth of time has been allocated, about 30 minutes of talking, and then plenty of time for questions and answers. During the session, if you have any questions at all, please use the questions box, or there is a chat facility as well. The questions one is the one I have open at any given time, but you can use the chat if that works better for you to ask me a question directly, or if there's any particular things that you want to know that aren't working. Somebody just pointed out you can't see the slides while the poll is up. Have I hidden them? There we go. Hide the results. Thank you. That's a really good example. I can only see my slides at my end, so hopefully you can all see the slides again now. So yes, if they have any questions as you go along, either questions for the panelists or questions just about the technology and how it's working, please post those up. I'm host, so I'm trying to keep on top of all the technology. And we've got two experts here I'm going to introduce in a second who will talk through the topics and tell you more about accessible apps. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my two colleagues, Robin Christopherson and Raphael Clegg-Vinell. Robin, can you say a little bit about what your role is at AbilityNet, please?
Certainly can. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robin Christopherson. I'm Head of Digital Inclusion at AbilityNet, which is basically being able to tell or speak to people on a regular basis at different events and webinars such as this, all about technology and how fantastic it is to help level the playing field and enable everybody to, make the most of their talents through technology.
Great, thank you. And Raf, you're in London, I believe, aren't you? And if you can tell us.
Yeah, that's right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Raphael, and I'm an accessibility and usability consultant at AbilityNet, as Mark said, based in our London office. My work includes reviewing and testing quite a range of different digital interfaces to identify potential and existing accessibility and usability issues. And our work is increasingly mobile-based, so I've tested a number of apps across the major platforms. This is most commonly with iOS and Android devices.
Great, thank you. And it's worth mentioning that you presented a paper recently at a major conference around, or a paper was presented around your research on guidelines. Can you just briefly mention that, because we'll come back to it later, but that's clearly an area that you've been focusing on.
Yeah, that was a paper I co-authored with a couple of colleagues, one from AbilityNet and one from Brunel University, and that looked at the existing mobile web guidelines, not specifically for apps, but just the standards, particularly from the W3C Mobile Web Best Practice Guidelines. And it looked at the user testing sessions we'd conducted at AbilityNet over the period of about a year and mapped the issues that we found by testers against the guidelines to find out how effectively they corresponded.
Great.
And that was presented at the Web for All Access, which was in Korea earlier this year.
Cool, and won an award. You're being too modest to mention. Okay, cool, great. So, just to get started, just a bit about AbilityNet, in case you don't know what we are and why we talk about accessibility. We're a charity that also have business services. The business services pay for our free services for disabled people. So we do accessibility testing, we do user testing, we do design reviews. We can work across desktop, mobile, and tablet, and we look at how those integrate. We can provide accreditation around accessibility and service agreements. We also have a tool called My Computer My Way, which is an interactive guide to all the accessibility features in all major OSs, operating systems. And that's been purchased by people like Barclays and BT, for example, to be included within their content on their websites for accessibility. We also, it starts to sound a little bit old now, but we did all the accessibility testing for the 2012 London Olympics, so obviously a significant sort of feather in our cap that we continue to mention at every opportunity. What we're going to look at today is about apps, and this has come up for a couple of reasons. One is because we were talking about the work that we're doing, and more than half of the work that we do within the accessibility labs now is on mobile, and a good proportion of that is about apps. But we realise that there is a big difference between what we do on apps and what we do in web-based content when we're viewing it on a mobile. And we were just discussing this, and the most obvious point to make is that they're not the same. That when you're building an app, you're often creating software really to work on a particular piece of hardware, whereas when you're creating web content, you're essentially trying to repurpose it to make sure it appears correctly in various sort of sized screens or different pieces of hardware. The other thing to point out is that apps are often preferred by disabled people. And Robin, you, I think, had a couple of examples of the simpler single-function nature of apps and why that's an accessibility issue. There are a couple that you'd mention in particular.
Well, certainly, historically, websites have been quite a challenge for disabled people. They're quite busy, they're quite cluttered, and they all do things very differently. That improved a bit when mobile came along and people started to create mobile versions of their websites. And because smartphones back then weren't consistently smart, then people couldn't rely on them, supporting Flash or Ajax and things like that. So they made them a lot simpler, and they were much more accessible. And a lot of people were even accessing those on a desktop browser because they were much more accessible for keyboard only or screen reader, etc. And they were much cleaner and simpler to use. And apps on smartphones have gone one step further. They often have a kind of a consistent, reassuring UI where there's just a bunch of tabs at the bottom and some content at the top, and they are a lot simpler, a lot cleaner as a rule. They often don't try to do too many tasks, or the better ones. And so I would always use, for example, the Facebook app. Not that I use Facebook very often, but I've had a lot of other feedback from users about that. It's a much simpler environment than the main Facebook website. Similarly, Amazon or eBay, pretty much any app that you would care to mention where there is a website equivalent, the app is much simpler, much cleaner, and more accessible the vast majority of the time.
Okay, great. So what we're going to talk about today, there are 5 things we're going to sort of run through about apps and making them accessible. The first one is about how to build it into your design process. Secondly, looking at making sure you're using the right guidelines. Thirdly, just a point about how accessible design delivers better UX, and I guess that's a reason why accessibility, which we're always making the case for, why accessibility needs to be considered in any design process. And one of the payoffs, if you like, is that better accessibility will deliver better UX. A couple of points about not breaking the particular accessibility features of the device you're planning to use, and then a little bit about how to test apps and any differences between testing apps and the experience of testing web-based content. If you have any particular questions as we go along, then do put do post them up on the questions section. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at the design process. We've got a graphic here which I found on boostmediaentertainment.com just by looking at what is the app building process. It's an 11-stage process here that's got a proposal and a creative brief and schematic design and step-by-step going through these from initial proposal to launch. But Robin, I think you've got a particular point about where do you think accessibility should be on this 11-step process? I mean, this is quite a complicated one, of course, but where does accessibility belong, do you think, in terms of the stages?
Well, actually, I think once you've designed and shipped your app and it's been approved in the App Store, it's at that point that you should think about accessibility. Actually, that's a joke. What you should do. And that is often what, when you get the feedback, because people are using it in the wild and they're saying, hey, I can't use your app. And there's a very easy way of contacting app developers, and they're a very vocal audience. And it's only at that point, when everything's done and dusted, that you realize that you didn't consider accessibility. So that's not the right approach. What we see here, all of these different stages, basically you can't consider accessibility early enough. And the ideal scenario is that you build it into everything that you think about. You just have a broader interpretation about who your users are, and you don't assume that they are like you with 20/20 vision, you know, full dexterity, power users when it comes to technology, because obviously, you know, if you're developing apps, then you're pretty technical. And, you know, right at the beginning, we're going to be talking about the guidelines and how they can prepare you for the development process. But even prior to that, in your kind of concept of the thing that you're trying to create, right at the sort of inception stage, think about a diverse set of personas so that you're catering for people with dyslexia, with vision impairment, who might be using the accessibility features built into the platform that Mark mentioned about earlier, that we'll talk about a little bit more later on. So basically, the answer is at every stage in the process, and then you won't have any horrible surprises, potentially costly surprises towards the end, or, you know, heaven forbid, even after it's been launched and you make a lot of people unhappy.
Thank you. And Raf, just from the point of view of your sort of experience in the lab, do people generally do what Robin's just suggested? How common is it for somebody to be putting accessibility right at the beginning of the process?
It's rare, but there are certain companies and organizations who are getting much better at it because they're realizing that if you factor in accessibility too late, they're going to waste a lot of time and money developing something again. Often it is far too late once something's already gone through a whole development cycle, and then, for example, a company has a couple of weeks to release an app or website and then decide, oh, we need to make it accessible. You then have to potentially go back and fix a lot of content and design. So there are certain companies though who are realizing the benefits to accessibility, as with UX, and factoring it in from the beginning.
Great.
They usually result in much more accessible and usable websites and apps.
Okay. I wonder, is it the case that getting it wrong on an app is perhaps a more difficult process to put right than getting it wrong on a web based content? Is there any reason why that's more complicated or more difficult in terms of the design process?
Not necessarily. It's just that, well, with each platform, for example, they have their differences. So designing something on Android will have its slight differences to, say,
Right.
on an iOS device. There are certain issues, for example, with color contrast is a good one though, that can affect everyone. And that's one of the easier things. We'll come on to how to test this later, but it's one of the easier things to test, but it can be one of the more difficult things for clients to actually fix, because sometimes it can have a direct bearing and effect on their branding style.
Right. Okay, thank you. So the next question, I guess, is if you are going to put it into your process, then which guidelines should you be referring to? If you're familiar with the Web Accessibility Initiative and W3C and the guidelines that they produce, then you may well be familiar with the mobile accessibility guidelines. I've got a page pulled up here. This is w3.org/WAI/mobile, the mobile accessibility guidelines that they publish. The point to make here, of course, is this isn't necessarily the right place to be, because this is all about web-based content, whereas as we've just been talking, this is maybe more about software development. So Raf, what do you suggest is the sort of guidelines? Where do people start in terms of the guidelines?
Well, a lot of people will tend to start with the most sort of internationally recognized guidelines, and these are currently by the W3C, the Worldwide Web Consortium, and they're, as I say, they're the most sort of internationally recognized community who develop these web standards. Now, they do have their own mobile web best practice guidelines, but these are more specific to actual websites rather than apps. And there are some other issues with these guidelines. One of the key ones is that they were actually released back in 2008. So as you can imagine, technology has come a long way since then. I'd actually recommend that the best place to actually start is with the design and development guidelines released by each of the major platforms. So for example, Google and Android, Windows and BlackBerry will all have their own guidelines for developers and designers. And although these aren't all specifically aimed at accessibility, there are a lot of overlaps. So for example, Apple have guidelines for target sizes of buttons and controls. They suggest that they should be sort of 44 by 44 points at a minimum. And this can really help users who struggle with dexterity problems. But these are sort of just general user interface guidelines which can actually benefit everyone.
Great. And it's worth pointing out, I've flicked onto the next screen there to show you that there are, guidelines for each platform, and we've put that content into a blog post that were posted up this morning to accompany the webinar, which actually runs through those 4 platforms: Android, iOS, Windows Phone, and BlackBerry, and indicates some of the accessibility features that it has, that each of them has, that you may or may not know about. And at this point, I just wanted to check. I'm going to launch a poll again. Which operating systems are of most interest to you in terms of building apps? Are there particular operating systems that you're planning to use? You're able to tick more than one, I hope, if I've set the question up correctly. And so we're very interested in seeing where people are planning to put their time and effort.
Whilst that poll is running, it would be nice. It would be good to mention that the amount of detail and guidance within those different areas, Android, iOS, etc., does vary quite considerably when it comes to accessibility, as Raph said. And it's really only iOS, not that this should affect the poll, but it's really only iOS that has very specific, very detailed guidelines to really support developers. And Raph's going to come on to talk a little about some specific examples. But also when it comes to the mobile web guidelines that we saw on the previous slide, it's worth mentioning that in many cases an app is actually developed in HTML, or it can be, and that can help with some of the work with the cross-platform development. So again, it ties in with the poll here about which platform do you want to develop for, etc. And in that case, the mobile web best practice guidelines are very relevant, and you develop some or all of your app in HTML, and then you sort of enclose it in a wrapper that, like an Objective-C wrapper, for example, that would then allow you to, that would make it an app that you could then submit to the App Store. So the first port of call should definitely be the platform guidelines, the guidelines for the particular operating system. But just to bear in mind that many apps do have HTML content in there, and that's where the mobile web best practices would come in.
Great, thank you. Well, the results are in, and overwhelmingly Android and iOS, 75% iOS, 67% Android, 25% Windows Phone, and just 6% BlackBerry, which on the poll, given the numbers that voted, I think that's 2 or 3 people mentioned BlackBerry. So as we might have expected, Android and iOS are by far the most interest to most people who are developing apps. And of course, that's also where, as Robin mentioned, maybe the guidelines have a lot more information to offer as well, possibly reflecting that. So next point we would make, I just hide the result, is that good accessibility is good usability. We have got, there's an archive material in our webinars archive about the connection between accessibility and usability, so we're not going to labour that point. But Robin, I think you've got a point about users maybe considered like temporarily disabled, and that brings in questions about visual impairment, using voiceover and talkback, colour contrast and font size, where people may not be thinking about every user, behaving similarly to anybody who may need accessibility for their own particular reason. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think about?
Basically, mobile computing is computing in extreme environments, and it really is the case that people who have 20/20 vision, who don't have any dexterity issues, no impairments of any significance, are actually temporarily disabled by the environment in which they're trying to access their mobile phone. Because if you're pushing a buggy one-handed, and you're trying to use your phone one-handed, then often you're less dexterous than if you were just using your phone, on your couch, for example. If you're trying to buy a gift using the Amazon app, for example, in your coffee break, and you've only got 90 seconds to complete the transaction before you have to get back to your desk, then you have extreme usability requirements. If you're in your car, you're temporarily disabled visually and from a dexterity point of view, because you can't interact with your phone for any length of time in those ways as you're actually driving along. If you're out and about and it's a bright sunny day and there's glare on the screen, and it's a relatively small screen, and if the text isn't of decent color contrast or a decent default font size, etc., then you're going to struggle. So in all of these situations, you are in effect temporarily disabled by the environment. And what we're finding is that the accessibility requirements of people who have a permanent disability and require, large text, a very easy user interface because you've, got a learning disability, for example. If you have fine motor control difficulties with Parkinson's, say, you need to have larger clickable areas or tappable areas, as Raph was referring to earlier. So there are so many examples where people have exactly the same requirements, and accessibility addresses those requirements. And so now mobile accessibility or mobile inclusive design isn't about disability anymore. It's about thinking about every single one of your customers, not just the 20% that have some sort of impairment. We're literally talking about the 100%, because everybody who has a mobile phone uses it out and about. They don't just use it whilst they're sitting on their sofa.
Great, thank you. And what that brings to light really is the question about personas from an accessibility and usability point of view. That the process that joins them together is about user journeys and personas. We obviously recommend that you think about accessibility across the personas and not necessarily just bolting an accessible persona on the end of your existing personas. Raf, do you see this coming through in the testing that you do, the personas and user journeys, and how that crosses over?
Again, it's in my experience with testing, it can be completely dependent on the client. As I mentioned earlier, there's some who really have thought this through, and this overlaps again with not just accessibility but UX combined, where users really have thought through different people who might be using a given app and designed with that in mind. So, for example, it might come across as a well-designed, simplistic app, but the actual client has really thought about putting buttons spaced out so that it's easier for people to use, and that then has a bearing on making it easier for people with dexterity issues, for example. Whereas others are still sort of designing at times for themselves, and it's not because they've decided to ignore accessibility. Often it's because you've got, say, for example, a young 25-year-old designer who's been given the scope to work on a particular project, and it might look fine for them. They might be able to see text clearly. The contrast might be good for them. Might have 20/20 vision, but it's sometimes just not being aware of how not making something accessible can affect other users. And one day, for example, with impairments, it's something that can affect everyone, because we'll all end up with diminished eyesight.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next point, that there are features built into every operating system that some apps make very effective use of, and in fact some and other apps turn off because the developers clearly aren't aware of the impact of what they're doing. Robin, do you have an example of this that you can give about apps that don't actually turn off the features that would be useful in terms of accessibility.
Yeah, so the operating systems and the devices have a lot of accessibility features built in, which enables people to access, to use them with regardless of what their impairment is. And if they then fire up an app that sort of breaks this link in the, that's the weak link, because it hasn't been designed in an inclusive way, then that's incredibly frustrating. And something like iOS is a particularly good example because the toolkit, the sort of box of bits that you can create an app out of in iOS, all of the controls, all of the screen elements are accessible by default. So if you build an app in iOS with all of the standard controls and elements and follow the guidelines in a very rudimentary way, then you kind of get accessibility free of charge. Images, for example, if you include those, they will still need to be given appropriate labels. But all of your buttons, all of your sliders, all of your checkboxes, etc., all of those will be accessible and will speak fine to a blind user. All of the page elements will be accessible for somebody who's scanning through page elements. Somebody who is completely paralyzed can use an iPad or an iPhone just by blinking their eye if they've got the right switch plugged in, because all of this accessibility is built into the OS, and your app won't break that inclusion if you do things in a standard way. So with iOS in particular, or quite specifically, you have to break accessibility by deciding to develop custom controls to do something slightly unusual in your UI in your app. And there, the guidelines are very clear about how you have to layer on accessibility on top there to make sure that you make it as accessible as possible. But all of the standard stuff, less so for Android and not at all for Windows Phone and slightly for BlackBerry, you get accessibility free of charge, and you actually have to sort of break it by going off track and building custom controls and that sort of thing, and not layering on accessibility on top.
Great, thank you. And it's worth mentioning again that the blog post that we've put together to accompany the webinar runs through just some simple examples, and then links you through to how you can find out more about the accessibility features that are built into those OSs, those operating systems. So finally, just coming to testing, where I guess the question that you would have is how do you test an app? Is it different to testing a website, web content on a mobile? And the answer generally, when we were talking this through, was it's a similar checklist. There may be particular examples where you need to test it to reflect the usage of an app as opposed to web content. But Raf, you test stuff in the labs already. What does the general answer from your point of view? Is it extra work, or is it the same work just on an app as it would be on web content?
There's a few different checkpoints and testing situations to consider which are specific to each platform, but there's also others which overlap sort of any digital interface. So for example, if I've been given an app to actually test through, this is with, I should point out, with me testing it, as opposed to a user with a disability or impairment. So it's never quite the same, because obviously someone with a particular impairment will have their own sort of workarounds and shortcuts to use certain things which I might not use myself. So sometimes I'm having to put myself in the shoes of someone with a particular impairment or disability. But for example, I mean, color contrast is a good one, because this isn't actually just specific to apps. It's the same across any digital interface that has a display, and color contrast is a sort of an issue which comes up in the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, mobile web-based practice, and it's something that can affect everyone. Now, I will go into an example in a minute about how you can check that. But there are others where, for example, with apps, that can be more of an issue than they would be on a desktop or with a website. So, for example, button proximity is something which you might not struggle with as much on a desktop, because most users are going to have a mouse, and you can be quite fine about where you click on the screen. Whereas obviously on a sort of mobile interface, generally with touch screen, if you can't be as fine, most people aren't going to be as accurate with their finger as they are with a mouse, then it's something that you need to consider and how it affects people who are exploring by touch. So there are others as well, such as the target size, as we've already mentioned, clickable areas, selectable areas of buttons and controls. But there are a number of things that you can test yourself just by using the inbuilt accessibility features on your device. So some are much better than others, I should point out. But for example, in iOS, Android, and the others, they've got built into their apps a screen reader. So you can just go into your iPhone, go to the accessibility settings, and turn on VoiceOver. And it's something you can turn on with a shortcut as well, where you can set it up where you just triple click the home button. This will turn on the screen reader VoiceOver. And then you can explore it yourself just by generally swiping through the screen, generally left to right to go forwards, or right to left to go backwards, and it should read out each element on the screen. So you then put yourselves in the shoes of someone who does have low vision or blind, and sort of consider how these elements are announced to them, whether it makes sense, not just as it's announced, but also in the context of which a button, for example, is placed. I'll go on to example in a second on the next slide with how to check color contrast. I think, Mark, you've got a few examples of some apps to look at with that.
Well, I'll come back to in a sec, because just to finish the last point on here, actually, because then we can just jump onto the color contrasting. There's this thing about, we obviously test websites at code level, automated testing, we call it, so we do manual checking and the sorts of user testing that you're describing when we put it into a disabled user's hands. But we also do test the code for compliance, and that spots things like whether there's alt text attached to a particular image, for example. But there isn't such a thing on apps, as I understand it. There just isn't any way of testing the code. And we also were discussing the fact that Apple does test the apps as they enter the store, and so does Android, although they test for slightly different things. But they definitely don't test for accessibility, as I understand it. Nobody tests for that. Is that right? Robin, I think you mentioned that the Windows Store has a flag for accessibility.
That's right, yeah, and it's quite an amusing read, really, because if I in the Windows 8.1, the store now has flags for accessibility, and obviously it's a question, a significant question as to what accessibility means there, and how a particular app gets a flag of accessible or not. Because does it mean keyboard accessible? Does it mean that every app that gets the flag needs to be accessible right across the board for screen reader users, color contrast? So it's a blunt instrument, really, but it's amusing because the vast majority, sort of 90%, 95%, say that they're not accessible, and with good reason, because they're not particularly at all. So but it's an effort, and we would applaud them for at least bringing that to people's attention, because there's nothing more frustrating for me as a blind user to download an app, particularly where you're paying for it, and then find that you can't use it, and that's incredibly frustrating. So just a bit like with your accessibility statements on your websites, it's really important to point out where the shortcomings in the content or the functionality of your website are from an accessibility point of view, so that people don't go and spend a lot of time and frustration eventually being thwarted by a particular bit of content. So yeah, and what Raph was talking about with testing, it's really important that whilst we can't test on the code level, there's an awful lot that we can do to check for accessibility by turning on VoiceOver, for example. And then after you've done the best you can during the development process, just like we saw in that 11-point process earlier, the beta stage right at the end, that's when you put it out to disabled users, or in our case, we can get disabled people in the lab, and those real life disabled people add that extra level of testing to be able to find out if it's actually real life accessible for real disabled people.
Great, thank you. Well, just as a final little part of the testing, when Raph and I were talking about this, it did feel that it would be helpful to give you an example. And I've taken some screen grabs from my own phone. I have an Android phone, and of a few apps which have different interfaces. And just looking at color contrast, but for those of you who can see the screens, it may be fairly obvious which ones are going to need the testing a bit deeper. The first one is Spotify, which has a white text on black background in the current version that I have installed. That looks good in general in terms of testing. You think that will be okay, but there is a question mark about that white text where it says shuffle play on a green background. The next one is Rightmove, I think, and there is a question about some of the text where it's the white text that's over the top of a photograph. The background isn't very clear there, and very small type as well, so that the actual amount of white type there is quite small. EasyJet's lovely long grayed out list of all the places that you can fly from. Well, you definitely couldn't read that with a little bit of sunshine on the screen. That's completely blank. So even just looking at it in one go, you can tell that's going to need a little bit of work. And then the question on the right-hand side with Dropbox is whether or not the blue text on a white background is strong enough. The contrast is sufficient. And for those of you that don't know, then there are a number of different ways you can test for color contrast. I've pulled up a screen grab here of snook.ca. There are a number of others that we link into. And what you can do there is take the color that you have of the text and the color of the background and then compare them, and then it will tell you whether or not they've passed sufficient contrast between the two. And of course, if you're doing the development yourself, you probably know the hex codes of those things because you're building it. And if you don't know the hex codes, then it's possible to just take a screen grab and run it through Photoshop or something and grab the codes from there. But it just shows you how simple that test is, just using a screen grab. And that's exactly the same as how you would test a web page, but on an app, you may have to just do that little bit of extra test to do the screen grab first. To summarize, we've been through 5 particular points. Just to remind you, first of all, just because you're designing an app doesn't make any difference in terms of our golden rules, which is that you put accessibility in from the start and you build it into the design process. And that includes all of those different stages that were on the illustration we had of 11-step process. Make sure you're looking at the right guidelines. That won't necessarily be web accessibility guidelines. They may be specific to the platform and about the accessibility features of that particular platform. Look at your personas and your user journeys and connect together, the fact that a more accessible design is going to deliver a better UX. And in particular in an app where you do have a lot more control and you don't have all of the clutter of web-based content or potential clutter, then that really is potentially a very good way of fulfilling that potential. Don't break what's already fixed. There are features built into all the devices which could be used for accessibility purposes. Don't switch them off. Don't overlook them just because you don't use them yourself, and do include them in your testing, which is the final point there. It's similar but not the same as testing for mobile web, and there may be particular things you need to test differently to make a successful app and check that it's accessible. I'll just mention Andrew has posted up a point saying, just to pick up on this thing about the different ways that things behave on different platforms, is often frustrating that developers may stipulate that a website is fixed within a browser, for example, and therefore on an iPad or a similar device, tablet device, you can't pinch to zoom because they've stipulated particular page sizes. So there's an example where on an app, if you want pinch to zoom, then you may have to just work out how that's going to work for the user, because that may be the easiest way for them to be using the device that they're looking at.
I think that's quite an interesting point, actually, or quite an important one, because pinch to zoom, as correct me if I'm wrong, Raph, only works where you've got web content within an app. So strictly speaking, you would either have to build in an enlarged text capability, or individuals can go to the accessibility features where there is a large text option. But generally speaking, it's more important to have a very generous default font size within an app, because that pinch to zoom isn't readily available.
That's right, and often it is the case, especially in my experience with the user testing sessions, that when users can't read small font sizes, sometimes because they have low vision, but also with older users, is that people will instinctively, sometimes even those without much experience with an app, try and use a pinch gesture to zoom in to read text. So often, as you say, if you just make it a sufficient size to begin with, then users don't have to worry so much about whether or not they can enlarge the font size.
Great, thank you. So there are a couple of questions which have come in so far. I'm just going to try and catch up on those, and I'm just going to throw one at you and then go and review the others. Richard was asking whether this takes it off in a different direction, whether you've got any thoughts about apps on smart TVs. We talked about particular devices. I guess we've been talking mainly about apps on phones, and we did discuss the differences between phones and tablets. But what about apps in other devices? Are we going to see that growing? And what difference do you think they would be?
In my experience, working with the people who were developing the UView platform, the basis for smart TV apps, certainly on that, at least on that platform, were that they would be web-based. They wouldn't necessarily look like websites or behave like websites, but the underlying technology would be HTML. So that you'd then look at the WCAG guidelines. It's interesting that there's a comparison between designing for a very small screen, i.e. mobile, and designing for TV screens, much bigger screens. They're actually very similar, and you should really be thinking along the same lines with regard to how much content and simplicity you should put on there, because having a full-size website, for example, on a TV that's 10 feet away is almost impossible to read. Similarly, as having putting a full web page on a smartphone. So cut it down, make it very simple, good use of white space, decent default font size, and that will look good on a small screen, and it'll look good on a big screen that's a lot further away.
Great, thank you. And another point here is so I'm just trying to make sense of this one. Oh, actually, Andrew just pointed out that he was the person who pointed out about the iPad. He's actually found a bug in the zoom feature in iOS 8. He found it last week and reported it. So that's to do with a pinch and zoom not actually working properly.
There are lots.
Yeah. When developing apps, is it a must to use the relative font size, such as %, other than PX or PT? So that's quite a technical question, but you mentioned the font size stuff. Is there a particular answer that works best for accessibility?
So it's not quite the same scenario. You are in effect hard coding. Well, the idea of scalable fonts, as you have in HTML, isn't quite the same in app development, and that's why it's important to have a decent default font size. You'll find that regardless of how you've defined the font, when you go into the accessibility features within iOS, for example, and up the text size, then unless you've actually done an image of text, it will scale up. But again, it comes back to making it a decent default font size in the first instance, because that zoom facility isn't present as it is, to be able to zoom up text on a web page.
Okay. A final one to wrap up a couple of questions that people asked. One of the questions was, do you have examples of accessible apps, or that you'd say were really good examples? And then someone else has asked, is there a list of accessible apps for Android and iPhone, not just assistive technologies and tools, but generally apps that are accessible? So, Robin, do you have a favourite example or something that shows how great an accessible app could be?
I only know of ones that are related to voice-over accessibility, which, as I probably mentioned before, blind users certainly aren't the be-all and end-all of accessibility, but we're probably the hardest to cater for, and you can often be there's quite a strong correlation between apps that are voice-over accessible and that are more broadly accessible, and those websites are appleviz.com, and they have a very extensive list of apps that, and they're updated very regularly. So each time there's an update to an app, people review it and update the accessibility status, etc. And there's a good description of what the app is, etc. So appleviz.com and also maccessibility.net which is accessibility with an M on the beginning. So those are two sites that have lists, current lists of accessible apps.
Okay, great. And Raf, have you got anything in particular you've seen recently that's come through that you thought, oh, that's really good. I like that as an example of accessibility being a sort of component of an app.
Yeah, I think the BBC weather app's actually a good example of an app I particularly like. It's something I use a lot myself as well, and also just the general design of it. But it's something I've tested out and found to be quite good with screen readers as well.
Right.
I'm particularly always looking out for the accessible apps, which I use myself as well. So though I don't particularly have any impairments, often the apps I come across which are most sort of user friendly are often those that have had accessibility factored in from the beginning as well.
And the BBC, is that you would suggest? I think probably we'd expect BBC to be an example of someone who has of an organisation that does build it in from the start. Of course, that's
Yeah. The BBC do a lot of work on accessibility, and it's worth mentioning actually, although they're not specific to app development, the BBC recently released their own accessibility guidelines, which are quite exhaustive, and they're a lot more up to date than some of the sort of more internationally recognized standards that are currently available.
right.
I think also if you want to get to see an example of accessible apps that are done very well, just look at any of the built-in iOS apps, the ones that come shipping with a device, including maps as well.
Okay, great. Well, while we've been talking, I've asked you how useful you found it. I'm pleased to say that at least majority have found it loads useful, and some of it useful. Nobody hasn't found it useful at all. Maybe they wouldn't be here at the end of it if they were in that category. So thank you very much for joining us. There are a couple of people who've asked questions which I haven't managed to get to. If you want to contact us, you're very welcome to do that. robin.christopherson@abilitynet.org.uk if you want to talk to Robin about anything particular, or sales@abilitynet.org.uk to talk to us about our services. And some telephone numbers are on the screen here to make contact with us, which you can also find by emailing Robin, and we can call you back. We have webinars, as I mentioned, regularly. We've got a couple next month set up. One is what every HR director needs to know about disability and technology in the workplace, which will be looking at assistive technologies and how they can help employees, and particular how employers, what their responsibilities are legally, and how technology can help with reasonable adjustments for disabled people. And then we've got a great one on the 21st on the accessibility front. How Barclays made the business case for accessibility. Barclays is one of our clients, and we approached them to help us with a webinar around the business case, and it's now going to be about their business case and what they have done to win the case. That's now signed off and central to their core business strategy, that accessibility is explicitly mentioned, and the case has been won with the board, and the chairman has been standing up and saying this is a really important thing for us. So that, I think, will make a fascinating interview with Paul, who's the head of IT accessibility there. So please do join us for that if that sounds interesting. Thanks very much for coming. There will be a recording made, or there has been a recording made, and that will be circulated. The slides are online, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and you can certainly contact us if you have any further questions. Please do get in touch. Thanks, Raf, for all of your help, and thanks, Robin, as usual, for all of your expertise. So thank you all for coming. Cheerio.